Hi everyone, welcome to Life Edge, where life just doesn't have to be that mediocre. And joining me today is our co-host, the one, the only, the non-mediocre, Dr. Susan Nash. Hey Susan, how are you today?
Great, really glad to be here, and we have a great guest.
Yeah, let's run our intro and then introduce him. Here we go. We're back, Susan. Would you like to do the honors?
Yes. Our guest today is Dr. Nick Norwood, and he is a professor at Columbus State University in Columbus, Georgia, and he is also the director of the Carson McCullers Center. And if you may or may not know that Columbus, Georgia is the birthplace and home of Carson McCullers in her younger years. So I'm really delighted to be able to talk to Nick and introduce him. So just wanted to say welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Susan. I'm glad to be here.
I wanted to start with a really quick question, and that is, who was Carson McCullers?
Carson McCullers is a great American writer from the American South. She is the author of the novel The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, Member of the Wedding, Reflections in a Golden Eye, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, and a number of really great short stories.
So what are some of the things that characterize Carson McCullers' work?
Well, a lot of people come to Carson McCullers when they're in their teens or in their 20s. That's when I first read Carson's work. And she's a writer who really connects with young people and did a great job of recording the experience of being a young person, of being an adolescent. So that's one of the things that she's known for. But she wrote about some other things, the need for people to connect, the need for people to have someone to love. She was a writer that promoted tolerance in an age, she was writing in the 1940s and 50s, when the American South, where she was from, was not a terribly tolerant place. But she promoted tolerance across races, across sexual orientation boundaries, across boundaries having to do with disability, gender, and so forth.
That's really wonderful, and it's fantastic that you, as the director of the center, have a number of opportunities to make her work more well-known. I was wondering what some of your specific initiatives are there at the center.
Well, one of the things that we do, and it's part of our mission statement, is to promote literature and art in Columbus, in the South, and in America. And so one of the things that we do in that regard is that we have an annual writers residency fellowship, and it brings a nationally known writer to the house to live and work there in the house that Carson McCullers grew up in from September to December. And the writer meets with our students, and they give a public reading at the end of that. We have a lot of events at the house for young writers, for our students at Columbus State, and also for musicians at Columbus State. And we do things like we did last night. We had the local Georgia author Karen Brannon, who's had a 50-year career in journalism and has written for all sorts of magazines and television networks and so forth. But she's written a book about the small town she grew up in, and about a lot of the racism there and how it involved her family. And it's a book called The Family Tree. So we had a nice crowd there for a reading and book signing by Karen Brannon, and that's the kind of thing that we do. We also do things to promote directly Carson's work. For instance, we are having a big celebration in February 2017 to honor her 100th birthday, which will be February 19th, 2017. And we are going to be putting on programs here in Columbus and also in Nyack, New York, where she lived during her adult life, and the home she lived in is now part of the center as well. So we'll be having a number of programs there that will feature excerpts from her dramatic works, and there is a film being produced based on one of her short stories, A Tree, a Rock, a Cloud, that will be screened in Columbus, and we will be having musical performances of Carson's favorite classical music. She had at one time wanted to be a classical pianist, and she was a great lover of classical music, and so there will be a presentation of the music that was dear to her heart.
Oh, that's really wonderful. And one of the things that always really touches me about Carson McCullers is the fact that she really suffered during her lifetime, and she didn't give up. She just continued to work, even though she physically suffered. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's true. She had rheumatic fever when she was in her teens, and it was misdiagnosed. And that was tragic for her health. She had her first of a series of strokes when she was still in her 20s. And so by the time she was in her late 30s, she could only walk with a cane. She was paralyzed on the left side of her body. And so she had great physical disability. And it was very difficult for her to continue to work. But she pressed on, and she published her last novel, A Clock Without Hands, after a prolonged struggle of over a decade. So it really is an inspirational story in that regard.
How old was she when she passed away?
She was 50 years old. She was
Very
born
young.
in 1917 and died in 1967.
Very young.
Yeah, she was very young.
Well, Nick, it's just very interesting, and I really love the story about how you became interested in Carson McCullers and how it related to your own work. And I would really like to hear more.
Yeah, well, like I said, I was in my 20s. I was actually in graduate school, and I was in a course on the 20th century American novel. And there was a list of writers that the professor gave us and said, choose one of these writers and write your term paper on that writer. And I saw that name, and I was intrigued. I'd never heard of Carson McCullers. I didn't know if it was a man or a woman, but I just thought the name was interesting. And this, of course, was before the internet, so I couldn't just look her up. But I went to the library and did some research, and it seemed like she was really interesting. And then I read that first novel, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, and I was completely hooked. I mean, it's a really amazing piece of work. And so I was holed up in my apartment in North Texas. It was very hot outside, and I just read basically Carson's entire canon. And I read a long biography about her, and I read a lot of the criticism. And, she became quickly part of my pantheon of important writers. And so she was one of those writers that I looked to as an inspiration for my own work, and has continued to be so up to this day.
Oh, that's great. And I've had a chance to read a little bit of your work, and it's wonderful. And I can see some of the resonances. I like your poetry and the fact that you really have a sense of place, and you incorporate a lot of descriptions, and also you connect to people's sense of, I don't know, just there's maybe the need for connection and then kind of existential loneliness. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about some of your books and where you wrote them and what they're about.
Well, like you said, I did get inspiration from Carson McCullers. There are, a number of those famous Southern writers, Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty, and Carson McCullers, that if you're from the South, you sort of can't avoid them. And so you have to read them, and then there it is. You're going to be influenced by the work that they did. And Carson's writing about place was very important to me, but also her writing about what she called the American brand of loneliness is something that I think has found its way into my work. And I am, I've always been interested in these works of literature that focus on a single person alone in the world doing something. I don't know what it is. Those sort of adventure narratives where there's someone who's, climbing a mountain or is lost in the desert or something like that have always appealed to me. And I like to present speakers in my poems who are in dramatic situations where they are alone, usually in nature, and they are, dealing with the situation on the ground, as we say. And I think that's something that was also important in McCullers' work as well.
It's interesting when you bring up the loneliness that a lot of people feel, especially in the U.S. in many ways. I keep thinking of social media, how people react to it. And I really wonder if it's not just because people are very lonely, they're desperate for that bit of interaction, whether it's from somebody they know or from a total stranger. It just seems to be that's part of the phenomenon.
Yeah, and that ties directly into Carson's work, and especially in that first novel, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, which is all about the need for people to connect. And all of the characters in the book go to this one character named John Singer, who is a deaf mute. And because he seems to be a great listener, they sort of pour their hearts out to him. And we find out finally that John Singer can't even understand half of what they're saying, but it gives them an outlet. And then we also find about John Singer that he has to have an outlet as well. And there's a person in his life that he goes to sort of talk to and to vent, as we like to say these days. So, yeah, I think it's true. Everybody has this need to have someone out there that they feel is listening to them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that a lot of people go online, go into social media for exactly that reason.
I love the concept that here is the guy that's deaf-mute who's the best listener. And also that it's such a commentary on the way that we really do communicate, where chances are we're listening and understanding maybe one half of what people are telling us.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And I think that, it's really brilliant. It's amazing that Carson was only 23 years old when she published that novel. But it was so perceptive in that regard, and many others, in fact, that it's kind of amazing in that way. And the great reveal in that novel when John Singer finally tells us that, I really don't even know what most of them are talking about, but it seems to make them happy to come and talk to me. You just feel like she has hit upon some great truth of human existence, and that she's putting it forth in that book.
Now, do you think things have changed from her approach and her perceptions back when to now?
Well, it's funny because she was really ahead of her time. A lot of the things that she wrote about in the 1940s, she was actually writing that first novel in the late 30s. It was published in 1940. It was radical and shocking at the time, and it didn't make people in this town, Columbus, Georgia, very happy. Because she was talking about issues of race, sexual orientation, loneliness, all sorts of things. And I think that it's the sort of thing now that has become commonplace in literature and in media. And yet, at the same time, there is still plenty of intolerance, to go around. And so I would say that in some ways things are just the same as they were in her time. In other ways, the rest of the world has sort of caught up with her.
I love in the Ballad of the Sad Cafe that Miss Amelia is the owner of a store, and she's like 6'1" and dresses in practical ways so she can take care of her still. Mm-hmm. and then she's been married, but only for like a month, and the guy was ended up going to prison. So then a completely unlikely person comes into town, Cousin Lyman, who may or may not actually be her cousin, and he's probably half her height because he's a hunchback and he's just completely ragged and stuff. And she's never shown any kind of enthusiasm for anything except maybe being like a tortfeasor or starting lawsuits. And then she really, really loves little cousin Lyman. And yet he doesn't quite love her back in the same way. And he ends up, well, I won't give away all the story, but it's like, I love the passage in that book where she talks about how love is always asymmetrical.
Right. Yeah, she talks about the lover and the beloved, and that it's always better to be the lover, and that the beloved sometimes finds it an annoyance, really, to have this person who's showering all this attention on them. And I think it's another way that she is very perceptive and a real original, because we always find in romantic literature where we have these situations where these two people are madly in love, and as you said, it's a symmetrical love relationship, and in fact that is probably seldom the case. And she is someone who wanted to look at that really closely and examine it, and probably the Ballad of the Sad Cafe is the best expression of that, and it's became a really famous work, I think, partly for that reason and for that famous passage on the lover and the beloved.
Well, it's so true, and it's like, okay, probably asymmetrical love, unrequited love, is probably the best fuel for poetry, and nobody really likes listening to poetry about what a nuisance to have all this attention or have a stalker. Although I wouldn't mind having a stalker, maybe.
Susan, look behind you.
No, those are stacks of rejected books that are stalking me. There's also some computer equipment that's stacked up over here that's stalking me. I can give you a tour, but it's depressing. So Nick, what are you working on now in terms of your creative work?
I'm working on my next book of poetry. My last book, Gravel and Hawk, came out several years ago, and I have been at work since then on a book that I'm calling Eagle and Phoenix, which is actually set, or a lot of the poems are set or inspired by Columbus, Georgia. We had a big mill culture here in Columbus, and all the cotton mills are closed now. This is something that appears in a number of Carson McCullers' works, in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, for instance, where she talks about the mill workers and so forth, and it's a culture that she knew very well. And all of those mills are closed down, and now we're left with the remnants of that very powerful culture. And in fact, I'm speaking to you from my loft, which is in one of those 19th century mills, the Eagle and Phoenix Mill, which has been converted to loft condominiums. And so I like that title partly, Eagle and Phoenix, and it's given me opportunity to write poems about eagles and phoenixes, which that's kind of fun. But mostly it's focusing on the life of the mill worker and also of other working class people, which is something that I know about firsthand because, my people were basically poor cotton farmers, which were exactly the kind of people who ended up working in the cotton mills.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because if you go further north, you wind up in Pennsylvania and all the steel towns that have just completely disappeared, just like the mill towns.
Yeah, it's true.
It's interesting. We've seen that, not oil to a point, though, for a while, probably about 30 years ago, oil was having a real bad time. I remember how many people moved out of Texas. Yeah. Everybody was coming to California in those days, and of course everybody left afterwards. But it's interesting to see how our economy and how those towns are so dependent on those industries, and then it's gone.
Yeah.
So what would you say the result of
that went around the globe? The mill culture started in England with the Industrial Revolution, and then moved to New England, and then moved to the South. And now, of course, it has moved on mostly to Asia.
Interesting.
And, a lot of the cotton mills now are in China and India and places like that.
Are any left in the South at all?
There are, but they're very small. There's one mill left in Columbus, Swift Denim Mill.
Okay.
But, it's a very small part of the economy. And at the time of Carson McCullers' childhood here, over 90% of workers in Columbus worked in cotton mills. Over 60% of them worked in this mill I'm living in now.
Interesting.
That's amazing, and it's fascinating, and the dynamics of mills. I mean, reading industrial novels, say Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, or is one that comes to mind, where you have such an awareness that people come in for the employment, but once they are employed, the conditions are very difficult. And then also you get a hierarchy in the town.
Right. Yeah, it's true. It was a hard life for the mill workers, and you felt for them when they had to work in these conditions because it was pretty horrible. I mean, there was no air conditioning in the 19th century, or in the mills throughout most of their existence, and the air was filled with lint, and there was a lot of danger. They employed a lot of children, 8 years old, 8 and 10 years old, working here at the mill. So you felt for them when they had to work in the mill, but it was even worse when the mill left. Now there's nothing for them. So it's been tough for the working class in cities like Columbus, and all over the South and other places, as you were pointing out, Rick, where there was once an industrial base, and now that's gone.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, and we had the opportunity to go to Pittsburgh for a convention a few years ago, and it had to do with petroleum geology. Pittsburgh was lauded for having clean air now, but one of the reasons it has clean air and no pollution is because the factories left.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now then they had a kind of a revitalization due to the Marcellus shale. Of course, now with the price of gas being down for a long time, it's tough. But I sense that in Georgia too, in Columbus, that there are these boom bust cycles that are on top of everything else, are complicating to people.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny that you mentioned Pittsburgh, which has become a great sort of vacation destination. I mean, it is a beautiful city. I visited there for the first time just a few years ago, and I was amazed at just how pretty it is. The hills and the rivers and all of that. Nobody used to think of Pittsburgh as being a pretty place, and I think it's probably the same with Columbus, Georgia. But Columbus is now sort of capitalizing on its mill pass because it has all of those buildings down by the river, and there's a real revitalization effort going on downtown, which has picked up a lot of traction, and it's making a comeback, but not in the same sort of industries that it used to have.
I love the way that Columbus State University has their Art Institute in these kind of repurposed mill buildings. It reminds me a lot of Baltimore too, but I think it's perfect because it just totally denotes creativity.
Right, it does, and I think that's a movement. All over the country. Definitely, there's a real movement to back towards urban areas as centers of creativity, and it really does feel like in Columbus, in the downtown area, there are a lot of things going on, and there is, a burgeoning creative class in Columbus, Georgia.
Oh, that's great. So, Rick, what do you see in California as sort of? I mean, we all think of Silicon Valley and of course Hollywood and LA as sort of the creative areas. Are you seeing anything similar to that, like going back into the older areas?
No.
Well, I think
we're a desolate wasteland of stupidity. That's all I can tell you. It's sort of sad, actually, but we're just not. It's not what it used to be. California is definitely not what it used to be. You don't get that vibrancy anymore of The Hollywood days are different. They're kind of over in a lot of ways. It's not exactly deep or profound for the most part. And Silicon Valley is different. That's up north. We're in the southern part. And up north, you've got a lot of intellectual acuity going on with technology. Not necessarily good and bad. It just is. I would say to a certain point, some technology is sort of soulless, and other technology can be very interesting. So I'd say we're not what we were. That kind of energy, I think, left quite a while ago, maybe 10, 20 years ago, probably 20.
I always think about when I think of LA, I think of La Brea Tar Pit.
Yeah, that used to be fun. It used to be fun going to see all. That's okay. That's all part of LA County Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's nice. But it's not what it was. It's not. You don't get that center of people really thinking about things and talking about it. Bookstores aren't that popular anymore. If you look at how many Barnes and Nobles are gone, a lot of them. If you look at the small bookstores, they're all gone. And it's such a shame to see them, because they had really good stuff in those stores, and specific stuff you don't find anywhere except maybe Amazon. That's it. So those are things people won't find because they'll probably never search for it on Amazon because they don't know it exists.
But is downtown Los Angeles making a comeback?
Slowly. But it's more in the culinary area, I'd say. A lot of new restaurants. But it's a really interesting juxtaposition of affluence and abject poverty. So it's interesting. I know people who go there a lot, and they say it's still a real issue with getting around, and it's not the safest place. You have to be a little careful, but they're trying to bring it back. So that's a good thing. That's a good sign. They've brought back parts of Santa Monica, and they've brought back parts of Westwood where UCLA is. So there is some areas that are growing, but I don't think it's coming back in a cultural way as much as a gastronomical way. More restaurants, more places to hang out, more things.
No, I did see like
Clark just said next to me.
Conference there.
Yeah, and like Clark said next to me just now, level and rebuild. So we're leveling some of the beautiful places we had, and we're building more cold places. Yeah, it's different. It's definitely not the same energy we used to have here.
Miss Lonely Hearts.
Yeah.
That's what I think of it. Well, Long Beach is kind of gentrified. And I was a little bit surprised. I mean, at least
parts, it's also one of the most dangerous areas in parts of LA. Lots of gang activity, lots of issues in You got to watch Long Beach. There's nice areas, and it's really kind of again, that mix of really dangerous and be careful, that kind of thing. But that's just LA. It's neighborhood to neighborhood, and it's got issues. It's kind of polarized in a lot of ways, and it's also a nice place. So it's that kind of mix of, okay, what do you do? Where do you go? When do you go? There's a lot of theaters still. But it doesn't have, I think, the vibrancy we used to have. Maybe, that's just changed. And that could be maybe nationwide, too.
Well, I think the small cities are definitely more vibrant. I mean, like Columbus is definitely vibrant. Pittsburgh's another example. Even Tulsa, Oklahoma City, was before the latest crash. But I mean, Oklahoma City with the Thunder and Bricktown and just lots of things being located there.
Do you know about a magazine out of Tulsa called This Land?
I don't.
Yeah, it's a pretty hip magazine, and I discovered it. I published a poem in the Oxford American, which is a magazine that it was originally out of Oxford, Mississippi, and it's about Southern culture, music mostly, but all sorts of Southern culture. They've done a number of pieces on Carson McCullers and on the McCullers Center, in fact. But there is a magazine based in Tulsa that I think is sort of modeled on the Oxford American, and it's called This Land. Poems by Nick Norwood in the next issue. So,
I will look it up.
So check it out. Surely your local bookstore there in Tulsa carries This Land magazine, so you have to check it out.
It may be associated with Tulsa University. They have a really strong literature department, so I will check it out. That's great. Congratulations.
Thanks. No, it's a really cool magazine, and I think it relates to what we're talking about because it's a magazine that is focusing on the culture the sort of hip culture, if you will, of places that are outside of the big cities. So
That's good.
that's good. Interesting thing they're doing, yeah.
Yep. Well, we are pretty much at the end of our time. Susan, would you like to wrap up?
I would love to. Okay, so we usually wrap up with a question that relates to the title of our show, Life Edge. So, Nick, what do you think it is that has given you an edge in life?
Well, I don't know if I have an edge in life, but I'll say this, that I struggled for a long time to figure out what I wanted to do. And when I decided that I was going to follow the thing I really loved, which was literature, I became a much happier person in my career and in my personal life. So I think that finding what it was that I really loved and following my bliss, as Joseph Campbell used to say, was the thing that has given me an edge.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's a good
I totally
answer.
applaud that. Yes.
She's grading you, so you have to be careful with that one.
That's so exciting, and it's inspiring. I totally agree with that.
Well, Nick, it's been a pleasure meeting you and having you on the show and learning about your area of this world and some of the experiences you've had there and the college. It's fascinating.
Well, thanks so much. It's been great to be a guest on the show.
Now, are there any places you'll be speaking or talking in the near future, aside from the college work, that people can come and see you, or how can they get a hold of you?
Well, they can go online they can Google Carson McCullers Center, and they can find out all about what we're doing there, and they can contact me in that way. And also, they should be looking forward to all of the activities that will be involved with the Carson McCullers 100th birthday celebration, both here in Columbus, Georgia, and also in Nyack, New York.
Great.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you, Nick. It's been such a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good one, everyone. If you're watching the show, please subscribe, give us your feedback, and we will have more information on this show in our show notes. So we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Nick. Great job.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.